Today I'm going to continue my lecture on issues, but I have almost completed the subject issues in the last class. But in continuation of my lecture on issue, I'm going to today start order 15, which speaks about disposal of the suit. After framing the issues or while framing the issues, what is that the court is expected to do? You all know when a written statement is filed and if there is any objection with regard to the material facts and also any material question of law, then the court will be in a position to frame issues. And at the time while the court frames issue, then it will see whether any question of law or any question of fact has been raised in objection to the material facts and question of law found in this suit. And the court is expected to look into the facts of the case or the pleadings, both in the plain and also in the written statement, and see whether there is any point of dispute between the parties. If there is any point of dispute between the parties, then only the question of framing issue will arise with regard to that particular claim. But at the first hearing of the suit, the court will see whether any issue has to be framed. What is that at the first hearing of the case? The first hearing of the case starts from the time when the court starts to apply its mind to the facts of the case. Till the pleadings are completed and also documents filed, the court will not apply its mind. These are all procedural aspects. Court will start to apply its mind only after the pleadings complete. That means plaint filed and also written statement filed. Thereafter, documents also filed. And after the court is having the pleadings, both the plaint and also the written statement, and also the documents produced on either side, then the court will apply its mind. And in the context of the objection taken by the defendant in the written statement, the court has to frame issues. Suppose in case the court comes to the conclusion that there is no issue at all, or the defendant is not at issue, you have to keep it in mind. If the defendant is not at issue with a plaintiff with regard to a particular claim, then the court need not frame an issue, but the court has to see, or court will immediately decree the suit as against that defendant, because there is no pointed issue between the plaintiff and the defendant on a particular claim. Therefore, only when the defendant is at issue with the plaintiff, the court will frame issues. Till then, the court will not frame the issues. But on the contrary, if there is nothing or no material facts are urged, either on the question of fact or on the question of law, and if the court comes to the conclusion that the defendant is not at issue, the court will immediately decree the suit. This is the first point. Therefore, at first stage of the hearing means nothing but the court starts to apply its mind. Now, the date of hearing shall be understood to be the date on which the court proposes to apply its mind to the contention in the pleadings and also the documents produced by both the parties. Therefore, the court has to look into not only the plain written statement and also the documents filed by the parties. Then only the court will come to the conclusion whether any issues have to be framed or not. Now it is elaborately discussed and a decision rendered by the Honorable Supreme Court. That case is reported in 1995, 3 SCC 407. Supreme Court deals with the definition about the first hearing. What is the court expected of after the pleadings are completed? Therefore, you kindly go through that judgment. Then Suppose there are several defendants. If there are several defendants in a case and some defendants are not at issue with the plaintiff, then the question will arise whether a decree can be passed as against that defendant who are not at issue with the plaintiff. This is a choice or an option conferred on the court is it can either decree the suit as against the defendants who are not at issue and proceed with the case as against the other defendants in respect of whom issues have been raised. Therefore, you kindly visualize a situation where the plaintiff proceeds against several defendants. And in that case, on going through the pleadings, the court comes to the conclusion, say for example, 2 defendants are not at issue. Therefore, in that circumstances, the court can either pass a decree as against those defendants and proceed against the other defendants who are at issue, or postpone the decision till the decision rendered after completion of the trial or conclusion of the case as against all the defendants. Therefore, it is a choice given to the court that it can decide the entire matter irrespective of whether particular defendant is at issue or not. It can go through the entire case and decide the issue. Not necessary that against the defendant who is not at issue, a decree has to be passed. It is not necessary. It can postpone the judgment or a decree to be passed against that defendant till the final disposal of the case as against the other defendants also. Therefore, this particular principle is discussed in 1991, 1 MLJ, page 210. And the court can pass an ex parte decree in case where the defendant is not at issue. It can pass a judgment immediately also, ex parte, and proceed against the other defendants. And then comes Order 16, summons and attendance of witnesses. And after framing the issues and the documents filed, and after this procedure over, under Order 15, the court has to start the trial, commence the trial. The trial will commence only with the examination of the witnesses. Normally, the plaintiff has to produce his witness. Now, once witnesses are produced and their examinations are commenced, it will be deemed as if the trial has started. Therefore, with the examination of the witness, after framing of the issue, the suit is deemed to commence from that day onwards. Then the plaintiff and also the defendant both have to produce furnished list of witnesses, and the witnesses must be numbered, and they can call one witness after another till the trial is completed. Now the question will arise whether witness will come only on summons from the court or by invitation by the parties. Here, parties means only the plaintiff or the defendant, parties to the suit. Now, there are 2 options. One, if any witnesses to be called, you can take summons from the court. You can take assistance of the court by applying for summons. The court will issue summons from the court. The court will issue summons to the particular witness, and the witness will appear on the day fixed for his appearance in the summons. This is one type of calling a witness on one side. Or one party can also bring a witness of his choice with the document also. And the witness will be called not only for tendering evidence, but also producing documents also. You can call upon the witness to produce document also. Therefore, they are supposed to bring that document which is specified in the summons, or any special order is passed. They have to produce the documents also. But normally, the witness will appear on the summons of the court or at the request of the party for tendering evidence only in order to prove their case, respective case of the parties. Now, in those cases where parties want to bring their witness of their own, then they need not take summons. But in cases where they want the assistance of the court, they can apply for summons and bring that witness for examination. And suppose where the witness fails to appear before court, even after receipt of summons, what will happen? Here summon is issued, as I already told you, that some summons are issued to the witnesses either to give evidence or to produce documents. Suppose if the party doesn't turn up, then if the court feels that his evidence is necessary or material, and also if the documents are to be produced by that witness is also material necessary for the disposal of the case, then the court will issue proclamation. First of all, the court will direct him to be present on summons. Suppose if he doesn't turn up, and if the court comes to the conclusion that he is deliberately evading service or evading appearance before court, and if the evidence of that witness is necessary or it is material for the disposal of the case, then the court will issue proclamation. Proclamation means is a command issued to the party to appear before court. Then this proclamation will be affixed on a conspicuous part of his house. And also in that proclamation, he will be required to attend court with that document required to be produced, and also he must appear. This is the proclamation. Once proclamation is affixed on the door or the conspicuous part of the house where he resides, and if he doesn't turn up, then the court will issue a warrant of arrest, either bailable or non-bailable. Therefore, the civil court has power in case the witness fails to turn up in spite of issuing a proclamation, and then the court will issue the exercise this penal provision by which the court will order arrest of that particular witness and to be produced before him. And in case, suppose one more punishment also, the court will order attachment of his property. And after this attachment is ordered, if he appears before court, then the court will, on satisfaction of his absence for some good cause, the court will raise that attachment. But he will be liable for the cost of that attachment. He has to pay or deposit the cost of the attachment. And if he is arrested and if he tenders evidence, this warrant of arrest will also be withdrawn by the court. Therefore, whenever a summons is issued by the court to tender evidence and to produce documents, then it is incumbent upon the addressee to appear before court promptly. Otherwise, they will invite the audience of arrest. Therefore, arrest warrant will be issued. And the court may, in its discretion, issue a warrant either with or without bail for the arrest or attachment of his property to such an amount as it thinks fit. And procedure, if witness fails to appear, if the witness appears but fails to satisfy the court, impose a fine. There was later on, after the issuance of warrant or an order of attachment, if he later on appears before court, and if he doesn't give proper reason for his absence on the previous occasion, then the court will impose a fine. That fine will be 500 rupees. And also, if any property is attached, as I already told you, the cost of the attachment will also to be extracted from you. He has to pay that the cost of the attachment also. And then the court has power to summon not only the witness produced by the parties, but the court has some extra power. Suppose the court feels any witness not necessarily cited by the parties is to be examined for a proper disposal of the case, the court will suo moto order a particular witness to be present in court for examination of that witness to throw light on the on the case or on the dispute between the parties. Therefore, the court has powers, so amount of power to call a stranger as a witness also. The court will first of all direct the parties. If any party is not in a position to clarify certain points, and a particular witness or a particular person is supposed to be conversant with that fact, the court can direct any one of the parties or in whose responsibility it is to produce that witness. The court will call upon the party to produce that witness. If the party doesn't comply with that direction or doesn't pay heed to that direction, then the court will itself direct the stranger to be present as a witness. Therefore, the court has ample power to call a stranger also as a witness in case the party fails to bring that witness. Anyways, a stranger means the stranger not cited by the parties. Therefore, it is called a stranger in the CPC. He is not really a stranger in the strict sense of the term, but he knows everything. He knows the particular fact which either party may burn for reasons better known to them. Therefore, the court, in order to get at the truth, may call a stranger also to be present. But stranger is none other than a person not cited by the parties. Now, next order is order 16 capital A. It speaks about there may arise an occasion where a witness to be examined by the parties may be confined in a prison as a detainee or a convict. Likewise, they may be they may be in imprisonment. In such cases, what is that the court will do? The court will order summons to those convicts or to those detainees who are locked up in jails. You can cite those persons also as a witness in your case. The court, in case, feels that their evidence is necessary, the court will request the prison authorities to produce that particular convict or a prisoner for tendering evidence by issuing summons. The court will order the prison authorities. Here, some distinction. Suppose if the distance between the court and also the jail is beyond 25 kilometers, in those cases also, unless the court feels their attendance is necessary, the court can summon them, but provided the party applying for the appearance of such a witness has to satisfy the court that appointment of a commissioner for examining that party in the prison is not adequate. It is not practically possible, or it may not be very convenient to examine that particular convict or the prisoner in jail through a commissioner may not be adequate. Then they can request the court to call upon that witness to be present through the assistance of this prison authority. Therefore, even beyond 25 kilometers, you can bring witness unless you show some explanation to the court that by appointing a commission for the examination of that particular witness may not be adequate or it is not practicable, then the court will summon that prisoner also for tendering evidence. This is spoken of in order 16 capital A. Court may request the officer in charge to produce the person before court to give evidence. If the distance is more than 25 kilometers, no such order will be passed unless the court is satisfied that the examination by commission is not adequate. Therefore, examination by commission is not adequate. Then even if it is beyond 25 kilometers, the court will issue summons for the appearance of the prisoner in a jail. Then the party applying for such a witness shall bear the expenses. Any cost of transportation of the prisoner from the prison to the court and also from the court back to the prison should be borne by the person who calls that particular prisoner for evidence. And overall, the state government has a power, a overriding power to block the appearance of a person or a transportation of a prisoner to the court. The court can, the government can pass a general order saying that a particular prisoner or a class of prisoner cannot be transported to the court for examination as a witness. Suppose for security reasons and also safety reasons, the state government can pass an order prohibiting the transportation of a particular prisoner for attendance as a witness in a court of law. Therefore, the court has a power. That power has been given in the particular order, Order 16, capital A. Therefore, the state government has also a overriding power to block any summons issued by the court. Therefore, in those cases where a particular order has been passed by the government, the prisoner need not be produced before the court as a witness. And the subclass 5 of Order 16, suppose just like we have seen in the earlier sections, where the person is put behind the bars for failure to pay the money, if it is a money decree, then here also the prison officer can refuse to bring a witness to the court if he is affected by serious illness, and also supported by a certificate issued by a medical officer that he is unfit to be removed from the prison by reason of sickness or infirmity. Therefore, if a witness who is lodged in jail cannot be transported to the jail, to the court, and a medical officer certifies that he is affected by a disease or infirmity, then the prison officer need not comply with the request if a particular memo is produced before the court saying that it cannot be done because of the medical officer's certificate. In those cases also, a prisoner from jail cannot be brought to court. And if a case is, suppose if the person undergoing prison sentence or a detention in a prison is committed for trial, you all know, once the charge sheet is filed and also on seeing the offences, the court will commit the accused for trial. If an accused is committed for trial, then he will be kept in jail. If he is kept in jail awaiting committal for trial, then in those cases also that particular prisoner need not be sent to the court for examination as a witness. This is also one exception. And then if the custody expires or the detention expires before the order that is stipulated or that is shown in the summons for his appearance expires early, then also it need not be complied with. But this is an obvious fact. Once a prisoner is sent out of jail after completion of the term, then he is free to attend the court. Therefore, if he receives a summons while he is in detention, and there is a time enough for his appearance before court, and in the meantime, if he is released, then he can very well attend the court. Then there is no obligation on the part of the prison officer to keep him in jail because for the technical compliance of the court order. Therefore, it is even ridiculous. Therefore, once released, he can appear before the court. Then, Order 17. Order 17 is an important provision of CPC. Of course, it speaks about adjournment. You all know, as lawyers, what adjournment is. Everybody wants adjournment. Even the judges are party to adjournments. Supreme Court has come down heavily on the legal fraternity as well as the courts. Even the Supreme Court says it is a criminal waste of time if the judge indulges in giving liberal adjournments to the parties at the drop of the hat. Therefore, one should be careful because adjournments are meant for, or adjournments are really meant for a genuine reason. In case a party directed to appear, or if a party directed to proceed with the case, not able to do so for some reasons, genuine reasons, then there is a provision in the CPC itself for adjournment. It is not as if we have to comply with the strict procedure of CPC or complying with the time schedule. If we are to comply with the time schedule, we may not get justice, because the court will pass an order on account of the strict time frame given in the CPC. Therefore, if the court is directed to follow that strict timeline or time frame, then people may not get justice. There may be orders that may passed even without hearing them. Therefore, to avoid such contingencies, courts are liberal. But taking advantage of this liberal attitude of the court in their efforts to render justice, adjournments cannot be granted at all for time ever. It is not an indefinite matter. You can't ask for adjournment indefinitely. Therefore, the court fixes, or sorry, the CPC fixes a time limit for adjournment. The court may, if sufficient cause is shown, at any stage of the suit, grant time to the parties and may adjourn the case from time to time for reasons to be recorded. Therefore, for adjournment also, the CPC requires the judge to record its reasons, why they asked for adjournment and why this adjournment is given, how the court satisfies. But of course, at present, in the present practice of our profession, I don't think the judges are writing the reasons for granting the adjournments. I don't think they call on. They will simply say call on, or at the request of parties adjourn. But they don't give any reason. Even the advocates who apply for adjournment may not give any adequate reason for adjournment. They ask for adjournment just for the sake of adjournment. But the Supreme Court has come down heavily upon the court's practice of granting indefinite adjournments, because it will do injustice to one party. And it is but the Supreme Court even says it's a criminal waste of time. Now we are committing waste of time. Not only the Supreme Court find faults with legal profession or our fraternity, but also the courts also. Courts means all the courts. Therefore, adjournment. Therefore, the CPC has now come with a time limit. No such adjournment shall be given to a party more than 3 times during the hearing of the suit. Therefore, once the suit is taken up for hearing, you can even take it a trial. Once a trial is taken, after the pleadings are over, then the court is not supposed to grant time for more than 3 times for a party. And the other party can also avail this provision 3 times. And cost of adjournment. Suppose in case the party is required or directed to start with the trial, and the party doesn't come prepared for the trial, then the cost of adjournment. The party will be mulcted with the cost for such adjournments. But these are all in the CPC, but nobody seems to follow it. This is the sorry state of affairs. And one particular provision you have to take into account is, once a trial is started, it cannot be adjourned. It has to be taken up on daily basis till all the witnesses produced by the party is examined. Therefore, then it will be a day-to-day trial. Once trial commenced, then there will not be any gap of time between one day and the other day. Therefore, if one day not enough, it has to be posted next day till all the witnesses are examined. Therefore, trial in all strict sense, the CPC says it has to be completed on day-to-day basis. No adjournment will be permitted. If the case cannot be done today or completed today, it will be carried over to the next day without any gap. And that is also given under Order 17, subclass 2C. And one more particular provision of law you have to take into account is, suppose if the pleader is engaged in another court, you might have come across this provision. This is also not a reason. If an advocate is engaged in another court doing another case in another court, it is not a ground for adjournment in another court. Therefore, it is for the party to make arrangement for proceeding with the case, not for getting adjournment. Therefore, engagement of a lawyer in another case is not a ground for adjournment in another court. And one more particular provision, you kindly take a note. Illness of a pleader. But courts are very, very liberal. You might have come across request made by the lawyers. Always say that the counsel is sick. Counsel is not able to come because he is undergoing an operation. He is taking treatment for a major ailment. In those cases, the courts are very liberal. Even the other side advocates, if appearing for the other party in the case, may not object to such a request because we all belong to the same fraternity. But what the CPC says, illness of a pleader is no ground for adjournment. But if an advocate is suffering from any illness and not able to come or undergoing any medical treatment, then the court has to, you have to give reasons as to why you are not able to engage another lawyer in his place. That is the requirement. It is expected of from a person who asks for adjournment on the ground of illness of the advocate. Therefore, one has to explain to the court why another lawyer cannot be appointed in his place during his treatment. Therefore, if the court is convinced that another lawyer could not have been appointed in his place on account of certain reasons, and if it is acceptable to court, then the court will grant adjournment. Otherwise, if the court cannot grant adjournment, but this is in the statute book. Therefore, you have to understand the CPC is very strict, but courts are very liberal in cases of this ailment of lawyers. And even the lawyer appearing on the other side may not be very much particular about opposing it. They may also concede the request because we all belong to the same fraternity. Courts are also liberal in those cases, but the CP is very strict. You have to take you take down this provision D, order 17, rule sub rule 2 D, class D. C and D is a very material. Then order 18. Order 18 speaks about the right to begin. Who has to begin the examination of witnesses, whether the plaintiff or the defendant? A dilemma will arise. And also, it is also a ticklish question as to who should begin the trial. Once the issues are settled, then the suit will be ripe for trial. When it is ripe for trial, definitely one will expect that the plaintiff will start his case or will begin the trial by examining his witness. Now, who will initiate or who will start the trial? Here, whether the plaintiff or the defendant. Here, a small intricacy is, or a intricacy of law is, in case the defendant opposes the plaintiff's claim by producing any evidence or by an emphatic statement that the plaintiff is not entitled to the relief as asked for by him, by producing any evidence or by asserting a particular fact, then it will be incumbent upon the defendant to produce his witness or to prove that plaintiff is not entitled to. Therefore, the onus of the evidence shifts to the defendant. Therefore, then in case, because the plaintiff cannot be expected to prove the negative. But when the defendant comes with a particular fact or a fact which is peculiar to his knowledge, and if he is assert and also produces certain documents, and which will show that there is a prima facie case in favor of the defendant, then the court will expect him to produce to prove his case to non-suit the plaintiff. Therefore, he has to begin. because he is coming with a positive assertion that the plaintiff is not entitled to that particular relief, then he has to begin the case. He has to examine. Then the plaintiff has the right to normally, the normal rule is the plaintiff has to begin the case. He has to begin the trial. But this is an exception. If the defendant asserts, unless the defendant admits the facts, suppose if the defendant admits the facts, then there's the end of the matter, the suit will be decreed. But if he asserts that the plaintiff is not entitled on the basis of certain facts, which is exclusively within his knowledge or within his possession, then he is expected to start the trial. Not entitled to any part of the relief. Suppose, take for example, if a suit is filed for recovery of rupees 1 lakh by the plaintiff, but the defendant says, I have already paid this amount and discharged this loan by issuing a check or by getting a draft in favor of the plaintiff, and suppressing this fact, now the plaintiff has filed this suit, a frivolous and vexatious suit against the defendant. In such of those cases, he comes forward with a particular fact that he paid it, that he paid the amount by way of a check and by way of another draft also. In such of those cases, the plaintiff, of course, he suppressed the fact if it is really true, but he comes forward with a case for recovery of an amount from the defendant. But he says, I paid it. When he says with a positive assertion that he paid it, that he paid it cannot be denied, but that the proof for he paid the amount cannot be disputed by the plaintiff. It is for the defendant to prove by examining himself or examining his own witness. Therefore, in such of those cases, the defendant has to begin the trial by examining his witness. Therefore, in those cases, the normal rule the normal rule gives way to an exceptional rule. Therefore, this is an exception to the normal rule. And the plaintiff has the right to begin unless admits the facts alleged by the plaintiff and extends that either in point of law or on some additional facts alleged by the defendant, the plaintiff is not entitled to any part of the relief which he seeks, in which case the defendant has the right to begin. Here, one particular fact you have to take into account is that he admits the fact, yes, I received the loan, but I have discharged it. Therefore, in his own statement made by the plaintiff, first of all, the defendant will admit, yes, I agree that I took a loan. But that amount for which now the suit is filed, I am not liable now because this fact which I have paid by way of a check or draft has been suppressed. But if that statement is taken, then naturally he has to begin the trial. And on the day fixed for the hearing, the party having the right to begin shall state his case and produce his evidence in support of the issues which he is bound to prove. Then the court will ask him, yes, you enter into the box or you bring your witness to prove that fact. Then he has to produce the witness and also any document, if any, to prove his assertion. In that case, the original plaintiff, after completion of his evidence, the party who begins the evidence, after completion of the evidence of the party, of the party who begins the trial, then the plaintiff has to state his general case as averred in the plaint. Then the plaintiff will be asked to prove his case. Therefore, the defendant will complete his trial by beginning the trial. Then thereafter, after completion of his evidence, then the court will come to the plaintiff. The plaintiff has to now answer the general case or his address his general case as stated in his plaint, as stated in his suit. The other party shall then state his case and produce his evidence and then address the court generally on the whole case. Here, the party beginning to beginning the trial may either exhaust all his evidence or keep those evidence that are required for proving his particular assertion and prove it, and leave the rest of the pleadings or leave the rest of the issues for his return after the plaintiff's evidence. You have to understand, the party who begins to address the court for the preliminary assertion, he can prove it, and he can stop with that and reserve his general objection to the trial after completion of the examination of the plaintiff. Therefore, he can reserve it, or he can exhaust all the points because he has begun the proceedings, or he has begun the commencement of the trial. Therefore, he is expected to first of all complete his first assertion, prove his case on the basis of the first assertion or in pursuance of his first assertion. Now he is given right to start the trial. Then after completion of it, he can address the general issue also. He may have several objections, but the first objection, if it is asserted, it will involve or it will give him a right to start the trial. Therefore, he can stop with that evidence with regard to the first assertion, which gave him the right to start the trial. But after completion of that particular evidence in that with regard to that particular assertion, he can reserve the remaining objection after the completion, till after the completion of the plaintiff's general case. Once the plaintiff then exhaust his evidence, then the defendant will be given the liberty to begin from where he has left after the preliminary assertion. Therefore, these are all the legal pleas or question of laws. You have to understand it very intrinsically. Then here, written argument, whether written argument is permissible. Written argument is permissible under the Act itself. Order 18 provides for submission of written arguments also. But on the written arguments has to be filed immediately on completion of the trial or on completion of the argument. And when you either start the argument or complete the argument, but immediately you must submit the written argument. And this written argument can be filed by both the parties. And this written argument submitted by both the plaintiff and also the defendant will form part of the record. And the court is expected to see that written argument also. And then a copy of the written argument shall be simultaneously furnished to the other party also. When you file a written argument before court, suppose if it is the plaintiff who files a written argument, then before filing it, then you have to submit or furnish one copy of that written argument to the other side. This is vice versa. If the defendant files it, it has to be furnished to the plaintiff also. This is subclass 3A. Order 8, subclass 3A, capital A, and 3B also. Then 3, subclass 3 also says, then if there are several issues, and these issues can be segregated. As I said earlier, the party who begins the trial, they take one or two issues, and there are other issues also. These are other issues, he can cover it by tendering evidence, touching on all the issues, or he can postpone, and the rest of it, he can leave it for the plaintiff to prove. Therefore, where there are several issues, the burden of proof of some issues lies on the other party. The party beginning may, at its option, either produce its evidence on those issues or reserve it by way of answer to the evidence produced by the other party. And in the later case, the party beginning may produce evidence on those issues after the other party has produced all the evidence. I have already explained to you. Kindly go through Order 18, subclause 3 or sub rule 3. Yes. Then one nicety, a legal nicety is the plaintiff gives a list of witnesses and the defendant is also giving their own list of witnesses. Now, after the beginning of the trial, one more question will arise. Among the list or among the witnesses produced in a list by either party, who is to begin? Now, as between the defendant and the plaintiff and the defendant, if the question of if the assertion by the defendant using a right to start the trial, then that is one aspect. Then you leave alone these particular circumstances of a case. Now, after the issues are framed, the question will arise. The question of taking up trial will arise. Then, say for example, in normal cases, the plaintiff has to tender his evidence, but he is giving a list of witnesses. But when he gives a list of witnesses, whether he can remain silent without being examined, whether or not he is required to present his case by examining himself as PW1 or witness number 1 on his side. But the court says if he doesn't tender his evidence but allows other witnesses to tender evidence for him, he cannot then tender his evidence later on, but provided a rider, unless he gets leave of the court to examine himself. Therefore, the normal procedure will be, when you give a list of witnesses, the party should first examine himself as witness number 1, either on the side of the plaintiff or on the side of the defendant. If PW1, the plaintiff, is examined, then others will follow suit. PW2, 2, 3, 4, 5. Likewise, defendant also. In case the defendant doesn't examine himself and examines his own witnesses on his side, then the question will arise whether at a later stage the defendant can be examined, then can be examined, but with the leave of the court. Therefore, in normal cases, it is better if the plaintiff or the defendant examine themselves first as the first witness, instead of going through other rigmarole of getting permission and also leave and also objection. It is better, advisable, to examine the party themselves as the first witness in any case. There are party to appear, where a party himself wishes to appear as a witness, he shall so appear before any other witness on his behalf has been examined, unless the court, for reasons to be recorded, permits him to appear as his own witness. Therefore, it is safe to examine the party himself as a first witness. And this case of, and what will be the consequence? You can read a judgment that is rendered in 2002 3 CTC page 50. And Rule 3A can be construed as mandatory only to the extent of saying that a party who failed to examine as a first witness on either side, then he cannot be examined unless he gets permission. This is certain. Therefore, he has to undergo this trial of getting permission. This is certain. 3A, Rule 3A can be construed as mandatory only to the extent that a party cannot himself at a later stage unless the leave of the court is obtained. The party can seek permission even after his witnesses are examined, and it is within the discretion of court whether to grant it or not. Therefore, it is the discretion of the court. All the witnesses are examined, and in the list of witnesses, all the witnesses are exhausted. Then comes the plaintiff or the defendant on the scene at a later stage. Then he can apply for permission to examine himself, giving proper reasons. But if the reasons are not acceptable to the court may reject his request. Therefore, it depends upon the discretion of the court to allow such a permission or not. Therefore, one should be careful to examine the party themselves or party himself as a first witness to avoid complications. Now these cases are reported in AR 1999, Madras 363. This is one case. The next case is AR 1999, Madras 363. The next case is 1998, 2 CTC 733. And the next case is AR 1985, Madras 183. 2008, 4 CTC 490. 2010, 6 CTC 716. 2010, 6 CTC 716. Then this application, suppose if the plaintiff intends to examine himself, but not at the commencement of the examination of his own witness. Suppose if the witness number 1 in his list is now examined, but before that witness number 1 in his list is examined, if the plaintiff feels that he need not be examined as a first witness, then at that very stage itself, he can apply for permission. Now, for such and such a reason, I cannot be examined myself as a first witness. Please allow all other witnesses to be examined first, one by one. Then, after the after the completion of the examination of all the witnesses, I may be permitted to examine myself as a witness. One can file an application, or this is at the commencement of the examination of his own witnesses. This application can be filed at the threshold of commencement of the examination of his witnesses. Likewise, it is not necessary this application can be made only at the commencement of the examination of witnesses, but it can be made after the completion of the examination of witnesses also. Therefore, this application, it is the option of the party, but finally, it rests with the discretion of the court. Either it is filed before the commencement or after the end of the examination. The party who has not chosen to examine himself, the party, then he can file either at the commencement or at the end of the examination of his witnesses. Then recording of evidence, that is subclass 4. In every case, the examination in chief of a witness shall be on affidavit. Now, by way of an amendment in the year 1976, now a particular provision has been introduced in CPC, authorizing or permitting the plaintiff or the defendant or any witness to produce their whatever they want to say by way of an affidavit. Suppose if the plaintiff wants to examine himself as a witness, then whatever case he wants to urge before the court, he has to submit by way of an affidavit. That is an affidavit filed, that is called proof affidavit. This proof affidavit are permitted to be filed, are required to be filed. The proof affidavit is nothing but, in olden days, chief examination. The proof affidavit takes the place of chief examination. Because even for restricting the time consumption for examining a person in chief, that will take time, some time. The court now permits, or the CPC is a new provision is introduced in CPC, permitting the parties to file proof affidavit instead of giving evidence in chief in front of the judge or in a court. That will minimize the time for examination of a witness. Therefore, examination in chief is now taken as a proof affidavit. The proof affidavit will be taken as a chief examination, and the opposite party will be permitted to cross-examine that witness. Once that proof affidavit is filed and the proof affidavit has taken the place of chief examination or examination in chief, the opposite party will be entitled to cross-examine that witness on the basis of the proof affidavit filed by him. And the copies of that proof affidavit shall be furnished to the other party so that they will be in a better position to cross-examine that particular witness. And the evidence cross-examination and re-examination of the witness in attendance whose evidence by affidavit has been furnished to the court shall be taken either by the court or by the commissioner appointed by it. There were these cross-examination will be recorded by the judge who in whose presence that cross-examination is made. Therefore, he can take down. But by commissioner also, this cross-examination can be taken. This is a rare occasion. Therefore, you don't pay any importance to that part of it. But cross-examination will be normally done before the judge, because the court has to, or the judge has to, study the behavior of the witness or psychology of the witness, or one particular word we have, that word the judge has to study the personality or the behavior of the witness. Therefore, the judge will be in a position to study the witness. And he can also come to the conclusion whether he tells the truth or lie. Therefore, he will understand. Therefore, the cross-examination or even the examination of parties are made in front of the judge. And the commissioner, this cross-examination done by a commissioner is an exceptional case with which now you need not bother your mind, bother yourself. The evidence by the commissioner appointed by it. And kindly you read all the other subsections. It's very, very easy to understand. You read the other sections. And then power to examine witness immediately. Then the court has the power to examine a witness immediately. Suppose in case where a witness has to leave the country, power to examine the witness, examine the witness immediately. The court has been given power to examine a witness immediately. Now you have now understood that the witnesses are examined after issues are framed, documents are filed, and only after the court applies his mind that the trial will commence. Only after completion of all these formalities, the witnesses will be permitted to be examined. But here, on exceptional cases, suppose a witness has to leave the jurisdiction of this court immediately, and afterwards he cannot be, it is not possible for him to come back, and also for reasons with which we are convinced, or the court is convinced that he cannot come back for tendering evidence. In such of those cases, or serious ailment, he is in a deathbed. In such of those cases, you can get the permission of the court to bring those such witness to the court and examine him immediately. Here, all the formalities are not required. Here, or you need not wait till the completion of all the formalities up to the stage of framing issues and also production of evidence. But at any stage of the proceedings, with the permission of the court, a person can be brought as a witness and examined. In those cases, these requirements are dispensed with. We need not wait till the final stage. That is production of the evidence after framing the issues. The court has power. That power is given 16, subclass 16, where a witness is likely, or when a witness is about to leave the jurisdiction of the court, or other sufficient cause is shown to the satisfaction of the court, why his evidence should be taken immediately, the court may, upon the application of any party or of any witness, at any time after the institution of the suit, at any time after the institution of the suit, even at the beginning of the suit, even before filing a written statement, at any stage of the suit after the institution, one can bring a witness by filing an application stating the reasons what is the compulsion for examining that witness without waiting for the other formalities to be completed. Therefore, any time after the institution of the suit, take the evidence of such witness in the following manner. Where such evidence is not taken forthwith and in the presence of the party, such notice, the court will then issue notice to the other side. Then the party requires the production of one witness, and we need not wait. We cannot wait. Kindly, the examination of that witness is posted on such and such a date. Kindly come. Therefore, the court will issue notice in case such a permission is granted. And then mere old age or apprehension of death due to old age is not a sufficient ground for advance and immediate recording of evidence prior to the commencement of trial. Therefore, taking advantage of this provision of law, any party may approach the court saying, I am old. I cannot come to court for tendering evidence. Therefore, you kindly examine me out of time at first. This may be a reason. And also, apprehension of death. Apprehension of death is also not a reason for getting this privilege of examining, being examined at first, out of time. Therefore, mere old age, apprehension of death due to old age is also not a sufficient ground for getting that privilege of examining a party at once. And only if person is suffering from, if a person or if that witness is suffering from a serious ailment or is in deathbed, if he is really in deathbed, in such of those cases, the court will permit serious ailment and also deathbed. And this also a subject matter of a case decided in 2013, 4 SEC, page 94. 2013, 4, section 94. Then the rule 16 of order 18 provides for examination of witness at any time before the examination of witnesses in the usual courts. Order 18, rule 3A. Yes, this is order 18, 3A. Kindly take down the case laws. 1999, 2 CTC 310. Next provision is very important. It is all very useful for a practicing lawyer. Order 17, rule 17 provides for recalling a witness. Once a witness is examined and his evidence is over, can we bring him back for further evidence? Suppose in case there is any ambiguity or in case any question not asked, a relevant question not asked, omitted to be asked, and also certain documents not produced or examination not done with reference to any particular document. In those cases, we can always request the court to permit him to bring back that witness. That is called recalling a witness for further examination. That is order 17, rule 17. Court may at any stage recall any witness who has been examined. Therefore, once a witness is examined, it is not as if that is the end of the road. We can recall him back by the ordinance of court under this section by filing an application. The power of the court to recall a witness at any stage under this rule can be exercised suo motu. Suo motu. Court has also the power to recall a witness if the court feels that his evidence is not complete. But it is a rare case, but the court has been given that power. But always it is at the instance of a party, the witness is recalled. Now you take down the, then can you bring the witness cited by the other party as your witness? No. You cannot bring the witness cited by the other side as your witness. Likewise, the vice versa also. You cannot examine the witness for the other side. Then this is ridiculous. You cannot examine a witness for the other side. You can examine a witness for you on your behalf, but you can't examine a witness on behalf of the other party. Therefore, it will not be conducive to a justice, impartial justice. He may not give a proper answer or may not give a proper reply Therefore, he may confuse the proceeding. Therefore, such exercise is shut. It is blocked. That is decided decided in a case reported in 1964 to MLJ 147. Kindly read this also. This is a peculiar case. A party wants to examine a witness on behalf of the other side. It is not permissible. And power of court to inspect. Subclass 18. Power of court to inspect. The court can also visit the site, the site of the suit, and examine itself as to what transpired, or the location of the property, the age of the building, and also the soundness of a building. Suppose in case the evidence produced on both the sides is not conclusive, or with the evidence already submitted by the parties, the court is not able to come to a definite conclusion as to what the ground reality is. In those cases, the judge himself can visit the property and take down or make an observation and record in a memo. This is also permitted. This is special power, a rare power. This power conferred to be exercised very rarely, sparingly. It cannot be exercised very often. But I have not come across any case where the judge visits a civil court. But there is a power. The judge himself can visit the site and make an observation, take down the findings in a report and file it by way of a memorandum. This memorandum forms part of the record of the court. And then what is the significance of this memorandum? Memorandum is observation. The memorandum of his observation, kindly take down, is not final. It has to be also considered along with other evidence. It has no peculiar or a special sanctity, a special significance the CPC doesn't attach. It is for him to inspect. It is for him to understand the nature of the case. Therefore, it is for him. The CPC enables him to visit, not for the purpose of taking sides with any of the parties, but it enables him to visit the property in case he encounters in ascertaining the truth of the case with the evidence produced by both the parties. Therefore, he can satisfy himself by making a personal inspection. Therefore, this memorandum of inspection will form part of the record, and he has to consider along with other evidences. It has not attained any finding of finality. It has no it is not final, and it is also not 100% probative value. It has to be considered along with the other evidences. Now, one case reported is 2012 5 CTC, and here also for exercise of this power, you cannot apply by way of an application. You can't request a judge by filing an application under this particular provision. That is subclass 18. It is not a matter for requesting or by making an application. You can request a judge to visit the spot, but the judge himself has to take a decision in case of any ambiguity. Now that regarding this principle, a case is reported 2012 5 CTC, page 407. 2012 5 CTC, page 407. As I have already said, suppose leaving aside or brushing aside all the evidences on record produced by both the parties, can he rely on his own memo of inspection or memo of finding? No. As I have said, it has no special sanctity attached to it. It has to be considered along with other evidences. Therefore, it has not attained any finality. It is not the final word on the decision to be rendered by the court. That is reported in 1973 SEC, page 831. Kindly read this judgment. 1973 SEC, page 831. Then in another case reported in 1986, 1 MLJ 473. This is a case decided by our Honorable High Court. Here, in the run control proceedings, the appellate judge, based on the power given under this particular section, himself visited the property with the assistance of an assistant engineer PWD to ascertain the premises, to ascertain the soundness of the building, age of the building, and also the structure, the soundness of the building. In order to ascertain the soundness of the building, age of the building, he took the assistance of a PWD engineer and inspected the premises, and he has also submitted a memorandum of his inspection. But the court held you cannot take the assistance of another engineer. You are not expected to take the assistance of an engineer. What the code permits is, or the power that is conferred under that particular provision is, you can visit and you can make an observation yourself, but you cannot take the assistance of another person. That is not provided. Therefore, that particular memo of inspection was struck down, and the court was directed to look into the case on the basis of the evidence already produced by the parties. Therefore, the court disapproved taking assistance on the basis of the power given under this section. Therefore, he can go himself, not with the aid of other person. He cannot take the aid because the code expects that the judge has to form an opinion by making a personal inspection. That is the purpose, not to embark upon a thorough inquiry, a full-fledged inquiry by himself, because one particular fact you have to take into account is that he cannot be cross-examined. Just like in other cases where witness can be cross-examined with regard to the facts argued by them, this judge cannot be cross-examined. Therefore, that power is given, he has to exercise it himself. It has no probative value, but only for him to satisfy himself about the nature of the building or nature of the case. This is reported in 1986, 1 MLJ 473. And next is Order 20, Judgment and Decree. But anyway, I will complete this Order 20 today itself. The court, after the case has been heard, shall pronounce the judgment in the open court. The judge has to pronounce its judgment only in the open court. And while pronouncing the judgment, the judge has to sign it. The judge has to put the date. And the date of pronouncement of the judgment is the judgment on the day when it was pronounced. And even in stray cases, the judges may sign it later. But the record will show, or any proceedings, only the date on which the judgment was pronounced is the date on which it will be taken that judgment was pronounced, not the day when the judge signed it. Therefore, you take note of it. That is Order 20. The court, after the case has been heard, shall pronounce the judgment in the open court, either at once. But suppose if the trial is over, then the turn comes for the judge to pronounce the judgment. The judge may pronounce the judgment on the very day, if he is very conversant with the facts, or if he has been writing the judgment all along. After conclusion, he can dictate the judgment straight away. Just like in appeals in the High Court or in any other higher courts, the trial court can also pronounce judgment on the very day when the trial concludes, if he is resourceful enough. But anyway, in the trial cases, the judge has to look into all the documents, study all the papers. Therefore, it may require time, but he can take time. But he has to, if he doesn't pronounce the judgment on the day when the trial concludes, then he has to, there is an obligation, render the judgment or pronounce the judgment within 30 days, first, within 30 days. Or in exceptional cases, 60 days. But 30 days will be counted from the day when the hearing is over. Likewise, 60 days also is a further extension of another 30 days, 60 days. It will be counted from the day when the hearing was over. There were this in exceptional cases, 60 days. There were in all, only 60 days has been given to a judge, a trial judge, to pronounce his judgment. Now, the judge shall pronounce a judgment written, but not pronounced by his predecessor. Suppose if the judge, he has dictated the judgment in full, but there may be cases the judges, the judge was not able to pronounce that judgment, or he is removed from the scene. He is not there, a judge, but he has completed his judgment, completed his dictation of the judgment. The other judge, a successor judge, when he comes to the court, he can pronounce judgment and sign it as if it is pronounced by him. But provided the judgment might have been dictated in full, if there is any deficiency, that means if the judgment is not full or not addressing all the issues that is raised in the case, and if it is considered incomplete, he cannot do it. He has to once over again hear the argument of the parties, then only he can pronounce his own judgment. But he cannot sign an incomplete judgment and pronounce it as if it is his. Therefore, the judgment must be complete in all details. The judge not completing the judgment before he delivered his decision, and the judgment not answering all the issues, it would be no judgment at all. Therefore, he can sign a judgment and pronounce it once it is completed. But incomplete judgment cannot be pronounced by a successor judge. Now, it is also a subject matter of a case reported in 2002 Law Weekly, page 826, because it is not a judgment. If it is not completed, therefore he cannot sign it and pronounce. This case is reported in 2002, volume 2, Law Weekly, 826. The judgment shall be dated and signed by the judge in open court at the time of pronouncing it. And once signed, it shall not afterwards be altered or added to. Therefore, once a judgment is pronounced and the judge having signed it, then and also dated, then it cannot be altered or amended by any correction. But this is the general rule. But the exception you have already come across. In section 152, you take down that particular provision. Section 152 of CPC provides for correction. What are those corrections? The corrections are clerical error, arithmetical error, and also the clerical mistake, arithmetical mistake, accidental slip and omission. This can be done by exercising the power under section 152. But here also, in this particular subsection also, there is a provision for altering it in case there is an arithmetical, clerical mistake, and also accidental omission, and also this omission and accidental slip that can be corrected. But for these instances, once judgment is pronounced, cannot be altered. That is subclass 3. Then the court is expected to cover all the issues. While pronouncing the judgment, it is expected that the judge travels all the issues and renders his finding in respect of all the issues, one after another. Therefore, he cannot leave other issues unanswered. He has to answer, give an answer. Suppose if suppose there are 3 issues, one issue is considered, second issue considered, but the third issue, the disposal of that third issue could have been covered in issues 1 and 2. In those cases, the court will very often say, well, while dealing with the third issue, yes, in view of the fact, in view of the finding rendered in issue 1 and 2, this need not be addressed to. That is also. Therefore, that will be an answer. If third issue is taken up, and if the third issue is already answered in the disposal of first and second issue, then the court can very well say, in view of the findings given for issues number 1 and 2, third issue is also disposed of accordingly. Therefore, but technically speaking, all the issues have to be addressed to by the judge. And kindly, if you are not taken it, you kindly take down this case law also. 2000, volume 3, CTC, page 617. And another case is 1997, 1 CTC, 584. But this case law relates to that correction or alteration of the judgment once pronounced. What are the circumstances under which the courts are given power to alter its arithmetical mistake? Likewise, it is discussed in these two cases. And the court shall state its decision on each issue. And one more case is, suppose a defendant is set ex parte. Can the suit be decreed by a one-line judgment? Decree will be drafted in accordance with the findings in the judgment or in line with the findings in the judgment. Therefore, the judgment should be elaborate. The judgment should give reason for its conclusion. Therefore, it has to discuss the pleas and also the evidence recorded, evidence produced by both the parties. Therefore, then only it will make a full-fledged judgment. Otherwise, it is not a judgment at all. But in case of ex parte decree, what is that the court is expected to do or required to do? Can the court say the defendant absent, no written statement filed? Yes, set ex parte and also decree passed. Or judgment is delivered, decreeing the suit. Is a one-line order. Is it possible? No. The judgment should meet all the requirements that is expected. And what the judgment should be like? The judgment should deal with all the points at issue. Suppose in case a written statement is filed by the defendant and documents are produced, and in some circumstances, if the defendant is set ex parte, in those cases, the court can set ex parte, set the defendant ex parte, and proceed with the judgment in his absence. But the judge is expected to give reasons, deal with all the, he has to frame issues. Under this particular subclass, that is subclass 5, the court has to pronounce its judgment by framing issues on the basis of the written statement filed by the absenting defendant. Absentee defendant, the court has to render its finding on all the issues by framing it. Then only it will be a judgment. Suppose if the judgment is one-line judgment, because the defendant is set ex parte, the suit is decreed, it is not a judgment in the eye of law. Now you take down this particular decision. 2013 to CTC 388. 2013 to CTC 388. Now, when the judgment is pronounced, if the parties are not represented by a pleader, then the court has to inform the parties when the judgment is going to be pronounced. If suppose on the day when the trial concludes, if the judge pronounces the judgment, there is no requirement. Suppose if the judge takes time, as we have seen, first 30 days and the second 60 days from the date of hearing, then if the party is not represented by a counsel, then the party has to be intimated about the date and the time of pronouncing the judgment. It is a legal requirement. That is 5A. subclass 5A. Then one more thing. Suppose a judge retires after pronouncing the judgment, or a judge is transferred to another court. The judge will not be there where he pronounced his judgment. But as you all know, the decree will be drafted only after pronouncing the judgment. In those cases where the judge is not removed from the scene by way of a transfer or retirement, if he is no longer there, the successor judge will sign the decree. The decree will be drafted by the court, by the officers of the court, in line with the judgment. Therefore, it is not necessary the judge himself has to draft the decree. It is the ministerial work of the court office. The court will draft the decree, and if the judge is not there who pronounced the judgment, the successor judge will sign the decree. That is provided in subclass 8.